In this skill lesson, we will be looking at primary and secondary sources. Our learning objective for this lesson is to be able to analyze and differentiate between primary and secondary sources in Letter from Birmingham Jail. But let's start with a couple of questions. When you play a game of telephone, what often happens to the original message and why? What would be a better way to receive the original message and why? In my experience, the original message rarely ever ends up the same way that it started by the time that it reaches the end of the line. Humans are pretty imperfect transmitters, and details often get lost along the way. A better way to make sure that the original message doesn't get lost or distorted would be to send a letter or write an email. And this illustrates the difference between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are original documents, such as letters, journals, speeches, interviews, or even historical newspaper articles. Secondary sources include things like textbooks, encyclopedias, modern magazine articles, history books, and articles about historical events. In each of these cases, the authors of the secondary sources are relying on the primary sources in their writing, but they weren't eyewitnesses of those historical events themselves. Letter from Birmingham Jail is a primary source because it was written by Martin Luther King Jr. himself during the Civil Rights era. However, a book published today that discusses the Civil Rights era and Martin Luther King Jr. would be considered a secondary source. Its authors are looking at and relying on the historical sources to tell their story, but they weren't necessarily there themselves. But here is where it can get even more confusing. Dr. King quotes heavily from sources like the Bible or historical figures throughout his letter. These would be primary sources to him. However, because we are hearing these things secondhand through Martin Luther King Jr., they would be secondary sources for us. In other words, we are one step removed from those original primary sources that Dr. King references. And with that overview, that brings us to our tasks for this skill lesson. First, if you haven't already, watch the concept definition video and read the introduction on tab 1. The introduction is especially helpful for understanding this skill. Next, complete the vocabulary drag and drop activity on tab 2 to make sure that you are familiar with the terms used in this skill. Next, carefully read through the model page. The top half of the page has direct instructions and a checklist for applying this skill. The bottom half has a student example. Read through all of the annotations that the student made and ask yourself how he decided if King's reference to the Bible is a primary or secondary source. Also, notice the student's observation about how King uses the Bible as a way of comparing the civil rights movement to the early Christians. Finally, when you feel ready, complete the Your Turn activity on tab 4 and check your results for understanding. While primary and secondary sources seem to be a pretty straightforward concept, it can get tricky when you're talking about historical letters like Letter from Birmingham Jail that contain references to other historical documents inside it. If you get confused by this, please reach out to me. I'm happy to give you the extra support that you need to understand this.